Hi, we continue in Genesis 41 today, as you can see on the left side of the screen after the narrator has given us Pharaoh's dream, and Pharaoh told the people around him his dreams, but there was no one who could interpret them to Pharaoh. Or at least no one who would interpret them to Pharaoh, because as we looked at last time, none of the people around him want to give him bad news about an impending famine, assuming they understand what Joseph will understand about the dream. So before we enter into this immediate scene here, let's look a little bit about where we've been. We've been seeing how this chapter fits into this nice tight triptych, and the previous chapters all around Joseph being in the connection with the officer of the guard. There are sometimes translated captain of the guard. But we've also seen how it introduces a whole series of scenes in the Egyptian court and back in Canaan with Jacob and his sons that alternate here, as we'll see, the purple between Joseph and his brothers, and then the others, the blue ones with just the brothers without Joseph, etc. So we're entering into that whole sequence here through the next 4 chapters as well. And we've been looking at the rare Hebrew words in these 2 chapters, and interestingly, there aren't any in this immediate section. The last one was about the magicians in verse 8, and then the next one is in verse 23, because there's nothing new being said here. There's no need for new words, because the cupbearer isn't telling us anything we don't already know. So why is this scene here? And I'd like to suggest it's here so we can see how the inner workings of speaking and not speaking in the Egyptian court work, and why it is that Joseph is the only one who can speak up. It's not necessarily because God has done something special to him, which Joseph will claim in the next scene, but the narrator doesn't affirm, and we never hear him talking to God, but so that this foreigner who is insulted 3 ways by the cupbearer, as we'll see, can be understood as someone the Pharaoh can trust. So we've been looking at dreams, and I won't go over again what I went over the last few videos to highlight how this dream in our immediate scene, and as well as the one with the cupbearer and the baker, and the one of Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel, are the only dreams in the Bible that require external interpretation, including the New Testament, where Joseph, the father of Jesus, and Pontius Pilate's wife both have dreams which are self-evident. So I'd really like to emphasize here that it's not that the dream is secret, it's that the people around Pharaoh are afraid to speak up. And we'll look more, as we've been continuing to look at the parallels between the Joseph and Daniel stories today in both situations, as a demand for someone who can interpret, and no one is found. The difference is, in Daniel, there's an interlude where Daniel prays to Yahweh, which Joseph never does, and is given the interpretation. So we hear in the story there that the interpretation is from God, as well as the fact that the interpretation is not necessarily positive, in a way that this one will be, in the sense that Joseph will continue after the immediate dream interpretation to give Pharaoh a strategy for managing famine for profit, and that's what he'll do. And it's astounding how many commentators praise Joseph for that, but we'll get there when we get there. So looking at the key words we've been seeing, we're in this scene here, and obviously Pharaoh is in the scene for the first time live, other than the fact that we are in his head in the narrator's voice. And then this emphasis on the verb and the noun form of interpretation, it repeated over and over, and we'll get to the next scene next time. And also in this scene, because we'll see at the end, as you can see on the left side, he will change his clothes, is the ongoing clothing theme. And interestingly, in this immediate scene, which you can see down here, we're not told what he was wearing or what he changed into. It's just simply that it's a clothing change. But the next one later in the chapter will be very specific, as he's dressed like not only an Egyptian, but as the right-hand man to Pharaoh, which he's become. And so we'll look more at that as we go. So let's put our key words back up, and we'll enter right into our story. One of the first things we note here is that the cupbearer, or the cupbearer official, as I'd like to call him, I made a mistake here and left chief cupbearer. I'll fix that before I repost it here on radicalbible.net. But I have it right in the other situations, the guard office here and the guard officer there. I highlighted that to emphasize that the word sar, translated as officer, does not necessarily mean chief. There are many sarim, the plural, who are not the chiefs, they're simply officials. So we don't know if he's chief or not. We don't know if there are multiple cupbearers. Sometimes he's called the cupbearer official, and sometimes simply the cupbearer, as we see. So suddenly we realize he's there. We had not had any reason to think he was there, but that's the point, is that he's the right-hand man to Pharaoh in terms of food and wine. So he says, I remember my faults today. And that's remembering what he forgot, as we saw back in chapter 40. And as my note here below has, speaking up out of his royal role, seeking repentance for a sin Pharaoh would not have known about. Note that he's in the room, as my note has. Hamringhausen lays out the cupbearer's challenge here. He says, on the one hand, he stands to gain favor by providing Pharaoh with a solution to his problem. On the other hand, he must craft his words in such a way to avoid giving the impression that he thinks Pharaoh is impotent or lacks control. He does not tell Pharaoh what to do, only narrates his story and allows Pharaoh to draw his own conclusions. He also must recount the story of his imprisonment without reminding Pharaoh of why he was thrown in prison. So as we look closely at what he says and how he says it, let's look a little more at the first words he says. False here is hate, for sins, and it was translated false earlier because many translators are embarrassed about the idea of sinning before Pharaoh. But as I noted at the time, the Hebrew word is not inherently theological. It's an archery term meaning missing the mark. And so he could simply say, I remembered my mistakes today. There's not necessarily a theological element there. As my note below has an interesting form of chiasm, which is usually around words, here his memory is chiastic. So he remembered the dream in the first place, then Joseph was forgotten, then the memory of Joseph was forgotten, now Joseph's remembered, and the dream is remembered in that sequence. So it's an interesting chiastic element of his memory there. And I remember my faults today is ambiguous too. Is it he's remembering his past faults today, or is he remembering faults he's committing today, which is to say, up until now, he's not spoken up. We heard in verse 1 of this chapter, it's been 2 years since he forgot. And so he certainly could forget, and that's the point of the chiasm, that he forgot about it altogether. And now, in the context of dreams, he remembers. Maybe he doesn't remember Joseph's name. Maybe he didn't ever know Joseph's name. We never heard him speaking it out loud. We've never heard anybody speaking it out loud, except the narrator here, which is not quite out loud. And so that's ambiguous today. Ambiguous whether today that he's doing it or today that he's remembering it. And as he remembers it in almost the identical words of the narrator, which is at one level highlighting that he doesn't have a lot of agency and his words are not that important, but it's also highlighting the details of what he says and what he doesn't say. So let's look a little more closely at it. And as my note below has, assumes that Pharaoh wouldn't remember doing that to his chief attendants. But 2 years have gone by and Pharaoh's got other fish to fry, so to speak. Once Pharaoh was angry, Quatsef, using the exact same word as was used in the narrator's announcement of it in chapter 40 when they were put in prison. He put me, and he's speaking in the first person there, not in the often third person deferential form as in like your servant. We hear that more in people deferring to people in the Israelite or Judahite context, but you'd think that he would to Pharaoh as well, but he doesn't. So he put me and the baker official in custody in the house of the guard official. And that's the point of the parallel there, that captain and chief are the same word, sar, here. Notice that Potiphar was the person named in chapter 39, but we don't hear Potiphar named here. Is it not Potiphar? Does he not know the name Potiphar, or does he not want to mention Potiphar? Does he know about what happened with Mrs. Potiphar in the announcing of attempted rape on her part? We don't know, but it certainly seems like when the captain of the guard or the guard official's wife is out there yelling, "This Hebrew has come into me and tried to have sex with me," or to insult me is the language she uses there, to yitzhak with me, people would certainly know about it. And it was her intent to have people know about it. In fact, we heard that she called all her father's slaves to hear it. And so certainly we would think the cupbearer would likely, if not have been in the room, would have known of why it was that Joseph was in prison. But he doesn't say anything about that. So he says, continue, we dreamed on the same night, he and I, each having a dream with its own meaning, or as I have here on the right side, more specifically, I have dreamed a dream, as it was in every case with the verb and the noun match. And each dream with its own interpretation. Again, for some reason I don't understand. The OSV has meaning here and interpretation there, but it's the same idea in both cases. And this is where we see the insult. And as Rashi, the great Jewish medieval midrashist, notes, he says, "Damn these wicked people who can't even do someone a favor without insulting him." And I just love the modern soundingness of that line. Maybe it sounded different in Hebrew, but that's how I got it in translation. 3 ways. He's calling him young here, a na'ar, or a lad, or a boy. And we know he may have been 17 when his brothers sold him, or at least when that scene started. We don't know much time went by in that context. But We certainly know that at least 2 years, if not more, have gone by, and it certainly seems like it was more, that he was working for Potiphar for a while, perhaps before Mrs. Potiphar found herself drawn to him, etc. So he's certainly an adult now in a world where you become an adult at puberty at 12 or 13. And calling him a Hebrew is also an insult. He's not exactly an Israelite because he's literally a son of Israel, a Bene Yisrael, which is what the English term Israelite is translating, but they're not a people yet. It's simply an immediate family. So calling him a Hebrew boy is both insulting him for his age and as a crosser, as a sense as a foreigner who doesn't belong here. And he was there with us, and he's described as a slave of the guard official. So 3 levels of insult: ethnicity, age, and class or rank there, before he announces what happened. You wouldn't think that would be what's likely to get Joseph favor in Pharaoh's eyes, but Pharaoh doesn't care about any of that. He cares about having his dream interpreted, as we'll see. When we told him, he interpreted our dreams to us, again using the same word, giving an interpretation to each according to his dream. Why does he need to tell Pharaoh that? Why is it important in his recitation to tell Pharaoh the details? You'd think that he just want to say, I found this guy, he did a good job, and get out of there before he puts his foot in his mouth or gets himself thrown back into custody. Pharaoh does not need to know that, other than the fact that it's suggesting that Joseph's dream interpretation is not generic, but fits the images of each dream, which it did. So as he interpreted it, so it turned out. And we might have kept the next sentence out, but he says it. I was restored or returned to my office, as I translated consistently in most places, using the Hebrew shub for return, and the baker was hanged. And you got to wonder whether he thinks, I'm still at risk here. This is a Pharaoh who lost his temper and can throw people in prison and then kill one of them. He could have killed us both, but that's what he speaks up. And Pharaoh doesn't question him. He doesn't ask anybody for another witness. He simply goes into action, whether it's because he trusts the cupbearer so much or because he's just so eager, because as we saw in verse 1, the 2 years could suggest not only was Joseph in prison for 2 years, but Pharaoh had been having this repetitive dream regularly for 2 years. So in that case, he'd be very eager to find someone who could interpret it. So we get here, and with no further intervention here, Pharaoh sent for Joseph. As Turner notes below, Pharaoh does not investigate the reasons for Joseph's imprisonment nor the seriousness of his crime. Thus, Pharaoh is presented as an absolute monarch who can release prisoners on a whim. But as my note below has, it suggests that Pharaoh is so disturbed in spirit that he fails to engage in prudence in considering who this Joseph is beyond his capacity as dream interpreter. As Grossman notes below, Pharaoh summons Joseph because the cupbearer mentions his expertise in solving a pair of dreams. His ability to distinguish between 2 similar dreams is precisely what Pharaoh needs. And that's what Grossman is suggesting is the reason that the cupbearer, whether the cupbearer is thinking that or not, we don't know. We don't know if the cupbearer certainly hasn't heard what we've heard in terms of the details of Pharaoh's dreams. And Pharaoh's said he's had dreams, but the cupbearer doesn't know anything about them as far as we know, although it does here said he told them the dreams and the cupbearer is presumably there. So it isn't told in narration. Presumably he did hear that much of it. So Pharaoh sends for Joseph with no ado, and he was hurriedly brought out, or literally he was brought to run out here, hurriedly brought out of the pit, or literally caused to run out of the pit. This has dungeon, but it's pit here. And although I'm continuing past this immediate paragraph, I wanted to set up the scene that we'll continue with next time here. So it is pit. The narrator picks up the description for 40:15, although prison was a different word, and so what's translated prison is different, and the New RSV translates as dungeon what is Hebrew bor for pit, but highlighting that it's the same thing as what his brothers put him in when it wasn't a dungeon, when it was not an imperial place of punishment. And then he had shaved himself and changed his clothes. And it's very interesting that if you look at classic art, you can see this kind of image of Joseph who may have shaved his face, we can't tell, but has hair in his head. But almost certainly this image is more likely the situation. And as my note below has from Westerman, it is only after this well-spaced pause, which says much more than any description of Joseph's thoughts or feelings, that Joseph, quote, came into Pharaoh's presence. Thus, this is the turning point in his fate. Chapter 41 is the center, the climax of the Joseph story, and verse 14 is the climax of chapter 41. But based on what is Westerman thinking? Why is the climax of the story that he's brought before Pharaoh to interpret the dream? Why wouldn't the climax of the story be when he reveals himself to his brothers way later? So it depends on what you think the narrative arc of the story here is. But as my note further down below has from Gay Robbins, in art, elite men, when depicted without a wig, and male household servants both have shaven heads. The former, however, usually cover their heads with wigs, which may be elaborately dressed, but which do not come below shoulder level. Thus, we can imagine Joseph shaving his head, as you saw in this image. And the shaving of the head has double practical purposes. It's hot in Egypt, and in that world, a hair would involve lice. And so having a shaved head would keep you from both having lice and a sweaty head, or at least a less sweaty head. And it was done by men and women who would then wear respective wigs much of the time. So, and is changing his clothes, as we note from the clothing element, as we saw at the very beginning of this video. We don't know what he changed them into. We also don't know who provided those clothes. Whose idea was any of this? Was it his own idea to shave and to change his clothes, or is it somebody else doing it? But we don't hear about anybody else. And certainly, we can infer one thing. He's trying to look more Egyptian before Pharaoh. He's not just cleaning himself up. The shaving his head is to make himself not look so much like a Hebrew and not have that be the focus of things. And Pharaoh will not mention it. So as we'll continue next time, we'll see Pharaoh will give him the dream and we'll compare the relationship with it, but with the narrator's version in the first verses of this chapter, but not before Joseph claims before Pharaoh that dreams are coming from God. We'll continue with that next time. See you then. Bye-bye.